The flash of red and blue lights painted the manicured lawns and pristine driveways in stark, flickering hues. The hum of the idling police car filled the otherwise silent street, broken only by the distant rustle of trees and the occasional muffled voice. A black woman stood at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed tightly, her stance unyielding, as though she were holding back the weight of something far heavier than the moment itself. Her breath came out in sharp bursts, visible in the cold night air, but her voice was anything but fragile. "This is my house," she said again, her tone steady, razor-sharp. "Check the deed. Check anything you need to." The officers stood frozen, exchanging uncertain glances, as if the sheer conviction in her voice had introduced a crack in their carefully rehearsed responses. Behind her, the house loomed, a picture-perfect emblem of suburban success, every brick and window pane betraying no sign of the chaos unfolding in its shadow. Across the street, the man who had made the call stepped out onto his porch, phone in hand, its screen glowing faintly as he recorded the scene. His heart raced, not with guilt, but with certainty. He was sure he had done the right thing. He had to be. He watched the woman with a critical eye, her defiance confirming the suspicions that had driven him to pick up the phone just hours earlier. "I've seen this before," he muttered under his breath, as if trying to reassure himself. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. An officer turned toward him, gesturing him over. "Do you know her?" the officer asked, their tone cautious but pointed. The man faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "No, not really. She moved in recently, I think." The woman turned sharply, her eyes locking on him like daggers. Her next words cut through the cold air like a whip. "Recently? I've been here 3 years." And in that instant, something shifted. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that everyone felt but no one wanted to name. The man's confident posture faltered, his phone lowering slightly as the realization began to gnaw at him. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a trespasser. She was his boss. And in that moment, as her unwavering gaze bore into him, he wasn't just a man who had called the police on his neighbor. He was a man who had made the gravest mistake of his life. And now the whole world was watching. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the truth behind this story. Lisa stood in the center of her sunlit living room, the walls still smelling faintly of fresh paint. Her fingers lingered on the edges of a framed photograph, her parents beaming with pride at her college graduation. Carefully, she lifted it and hung it on the wall, adjusting it until it was perfectly aligned. This moment was hers, the culmination of years of hard work and relentless determination. For Lisa, this house wasn't just a structure of bricks and mortar. It was proof of everything she had overcome. From nights spent studying under flickering streetlights to long hours climbing the corporate ladder, every milestone had led her here. She had earned every inch of this space. When she looked out at the landscaped lawn and the tree-lined street beyond, she didn't just see a neighborhood. She saw a future she had built, a place where she could finally exhale. But not everyone shared her vision. Greg lived 2 doors down, in a house that had been his since the beginning of the neighborhood's development. He liked to think of himself as someone who valued consistency, someone who knew his community inside and out. Over the years, he had developed an almost proprietary sense of ownership over the block. To him, new faces were more than unfamiliar. They were potential disruptions. From the moment Lisa arrived with the moving truck, Greg's routine had been disrupted. He had watched her carefully from his window as she directed the movers, unpacking furniture that looked far too luxurious for his liking. She was polite enough when they exchanged a brief hello at the mailbox, but something about her made him uneasy. At first, he brushed off his feelings. Maybe he was just imagining things. But as the days turned into weeks, his suspicions grew. He noticed the sleek car she drove, the visitors who came and went, colleagues, friends, or something else. Greg didn't know. All he could do was watch, each observation adding to the narrative forming in his mind. One evening, as Lisa strung fairy lights along her porch, Greg sat in his darkened living room, peering through the blinds. He told himself he was just being cautious, looking out for his neighborhood. But deep down, he couldn't explain the unease that clung to him like a shadow. Lisa, oblivious to the watchful eyes on her, had no idea that her dream home had become a battleground of unspoken tensions. Racial profiling is a stain that persists, often hidden beneath the surface of polite conversations and neighborhood potlucks. In communities that pride themselves on being welcoming, the biases that linger are rarely acknowledged but deeply felt. People like Lisa, despite their accomplishments, often find themselves walking a tightrope, balancing the pride of their achievements with the quiet awareness that they may be judged unfairly. Lisa had worked tirelessly to break through barriers that others might never face. Yet, here she was, in the home she had fought so hard to own, navigating an invisible threat she couldn't control. Every smile she offered a neighbor, every wave, was a deliberate effort to build a bridge, proof that she belonged. But belonging, it seemed, was not hers to decide. Across the street, Greg's focus sharpened. He told himself it wasn't about race, it wasn't about prejudice, it was about safety. That was the mantra he repeated, as he noted her late-night comings and goings, or how unfamiliar cars occasionally parked in her driveway. He didn't see a thriving professional woman enjoying the fruits of her labor. He saw something out of place. Neighborhoods change when you stop paying attention, Greg muttered to himself one evening, flipping through the local crime blotter for any hint of validation. He ignored the voice in his head that questioned his motives. This wasn't about her, he insisted. It was about keeping the community safe. But Lisa's presence wasn't the disruption Greg thought it was. His fixation was the real fracture, a simmering tension built on assumptions and unchecked fears. Each moment he spent watching her, each suspicion he nurtured, only added to the distance he created, a chasm he would soon find impossible to bridge. Lisa had no idea she was being scrutinized. Yet, in the quiet moments when she let herself relax, unpacking a book, savoring a cup of tea, laughing on the phone with a friend, the weight of being seen but not fully accepted was always present. The stakes were higher than she could know. For Greg, a wrong assumption felt like vigilance. For Lisa, a wrong assumption could mean her safety was at risk. And then came the night when Greg decided he couldn't wait any longer. It was past midnight when Greg spotted her. From his window, he watched Lisa step out of her car, her arms laden with suitcases and a briefcase slung over her shoulder. The porch light illuminated her determined face as she juggled her keys to open the front door. Greg leaned closer to the window, his thoughts racing. This wasn't the first time he'd seen her arrive late, but this time felt different. He reached for his phone, dialing without hesitation. "Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity," he told the dispatcher, his voice steady. "There's someone unloading bags into a house. I don't think she lives there." Minutes later, the flashing lights appeared, bouncing off the carefully trimmed hedges. Lisa stepped out of her house, her expression shifting from confusion to frustration as the officers approached her. "Ma'am, we received a report about suspicious activity here," one officer began, his tone neutral but firm. Lisa blinked, momentarily stunned. "Suspicious activity? I live here. This is my home." The officers weren't convinced. "We'll need to see some identification, ma'am," one of them said. Lisa frowned but complied, pulling her driver's license from her purse. "This is absurd. I just got back from a business trip, and now I'm being questioned in my own driveway." As Lisa handed over her ID, Greg stepped out of his house, unable to stay silent any longer. "She's lying," he called out, his voice carrying across the street. "She hasn't lived here long. How do we know she didn't just break in?" Lisa turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as she recognized Greg. "You've seen me here before. You've waved at me. Why are you doing this?" The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, asked Lisa for proof of ownership. She disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a folder containing her closing documents. "Here, take a good look," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. As the officers examined the papers, a montage of Lisa's life played out. Her late nights studying in college libraries, her first big promotion, the awards lining her office shelves, and the day she held the keys to her dream home for the first time. The officers handed the documents back, apologizing as they confirmed her story. Greg, standing a few feet away, began to shift uneasily, realizing his assumptions were unraveling. As Lisa gathered her papers, she turned to Greg. "I think it's time we clear the air," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "I'm not just your neighbor, I'm also your boss." Greg froze, his face draining of color. "I'm Lisa Carter, CEO of Bright Horizons Consulting," she continued, her voice steady. "The same company you've worked at for years, the same company I've spent my life building." The weight of her words hit Greg like a tidal wave. He stammered, searching for something to say, but Lisa didn't wait for a response. "Prejudice has a way of blinding us to the truth," she said, her voice firm but not raised. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before assuming someone doesn't belong." Without another word, she turned and walked back into her home, the sound of her door closing reverberating through the quiet street. Greg stood there, the flashing lights of the police car reflecting off his face. As the officers drove away, he was left alone with his guilt and the undeniable reality of what he'd done. For Lisa, the night was over. For Greg, it had just begun. The quiet of the neighborhood returned, but the silence between Lisa's home and Greg's was louder than ever. Inside her house, Lisa stood by the window, staring out at the dimly lit street. Her hands gripped a cup of tea she'd made to calm herself, but her thoughts raced. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice. She had dealt with skepticism, microaggressions, and outright hostility before. But in her own home, in a space she had worked so hard to create, that stung differently. Lisa knew she couldn't let the events of the night define her. She'd faced harder battles and come out stronger. Yet, as she sat down in her living room, she allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of it all. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who didn't get the chance to prove they belonged. Across the street, Greg sat in the dark, staring at his untouched glass of water. The realization of his actions hit him in waves. The image of Lisa standing there, dignified even in the face of humiliation, replayed in his mind. The fact that she was his boss wasn't the crux of his regret. It was the undeniable truth that he had let his assumptions dictate his actions. The neighborhood was abuzz the next morning. Word traveled quickly about the police call, and opinions were divided. Some sided with Greg, claiming he was only being cautious, while others expressed outrage over the humiliation Lisa endured. Lisa remained composed. She had no intention of letting the incident define her experience in the neighborhood, but she also knew the importance of accountability. At a community meeting she attended later that week, Lisa addressed her neighbors directly. "I moved here because I believed this was a place where I could build my future. But what happened the other night reminded me that belonging is not guaranteed. It has to be fostered," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "I hope we can do better, not just for me, but for everyone who wants to feel safe in their own home." Her words sparked a ripple through the room. People who had been indifferent before now felt compelled to examine their own biases. Greg, seated in the back, felt each word like a personal indictment. In the weeks that followed, Greg struggled to find a way to make amends. One evening, he knocked on Lisa's door, holding a small potted plant and a handwritten note. Lisa opened the door, her expression unreadable. "I don't expect forgiveness," Greg began, his voice quiet. "But I need you to know that I've realized how wrong I was. I'm sorry for everything." Lisa looked at him for a long moment before taking the plant. "It's not about forgiveness, Greg. It's about change. Let's see what you do next." As he walked away, Greg felt the weight of her words. It wasn't enough to apologize. He needed to prove through his actions that he could be better. For Lisa, life in the neighborhood continued. She remained a symbol of resilience, a reminder that progress often comes from uncomfortable confrontations. For Greg, the incident became a turning point, a painful but necessary reckoning with his own prejudices. The story wasn't just about one night, one call, or one mistake. It was a mirror held up to a society still grappling with the remnants of its biases, challenging everyone to see the truth and act differently moving forward. Lisa, standing on her front porch in the golden light of late afternoon. Her shoulders are square, her gaze steady. Behind her, the home she fought so hard to earn stands as a testament to her perseverance. The faint sounds of children playing and leaves rustling create a sense of calm, a stark contrast to the night that shook this neighborhood. Lisa's story isn't just about one encounter. It's a reminder of the real impact of prejudice, how it undermines trust, divides communities, and forces individuals to prove their worth in spaces they already belong. Bias, whether subtle or overt, is a weight too many carry every day. But awareness is the first step toward change. Moments like these challenge us to reflect on our actions, our assumptions, and the ways we respond to the unfamiliar. What will you choose the next time you're confronted with your own biases? What would you do if you were in Lisa's shoes, or Greg's? Share your thoughts below. The narrator continues as a montage of similar stories briefly flashes across the screen. People facing their biases, communities coming together, conversations leading to growth. For more stories that expose the challenges and inspire the change we all need, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can rewrite the narrative, one story at a time. Lisa, smiling slightly but confidently, the weight of the past night no longer visible in her posture. The screen fades to the call to action prompts, encouraging viewers to engage, reflect, and be part of the conversation.